these 3 weeks, of our forums. Today, I'm going to do a little overview of my renewal leaf, and then next week we're going to dive into some of the heavy topics, plural, that are facing the United Methodist Church in the upcoming General Conference, and I'm going to have at least an overview of the 3 proposals and then give you resources that you can read about them in hopes that we will do some dialogue as a congregation between now and then. And then the third forum will be split. There'll be 2 emphases. One is some things that are going on with the building committee and what a new kind of decision has been that has been made in the last few weeks. And I'll just leave it at that and tantalize you for 2 more weeks so that you make sure you come. And then the second part of that particular Sunday will be an overview of the things that we are doing and going to do, particularly from now till Christmas, in adult education. Okay? So all of the facilitators for those adult education classes will be here and give you kind of an overview of where they're going and how they're going to get there. Where I want to start is that my iPad just went off, so I need to restart that. What I would like to do is to read to you something that is from the Book of Discipline. This is important for you to hear as parishioners, but also for you to just put it in context of what I did and why I did it. Okay? This is from paragraph 350, called Continuing Education and Spiritual Growth of Clergy. Throughout their careers, clergy shall, let me pause parenthetically and say, there are two words in the Book of Discipline that are very important. One, the most salient word is the word shall. Okay? So this is the phrase, clergy shall. So there's really not supposed to be any wiggle room. We're all supposed to do it. We don't, but we're supposed to. Clergy shall engage in continuing education for ministry, professional development, and spiritual formation and growth in order to lead the church in fulfilling the mission of making disciples for Jesus Christ. This shall include carefully developed personal programs for study, augmented periodically by involvement in organized educational and spiritual growth activities. These practices embody the Wesleyan emphasis on lifelong learning, fostered by personal spiritual practices and participation in covenant community. Each annual conference, through the chairs of the clergy, orders, and fellowship, or other leaders designated by the bishop, shall provide spiritual enrichment opportunities in covenant groups for deacons, elders, and local pastors. I'm going to read you one more because this is where pretty much I fit. A clergy member's continuing education and spiritual growth programs shall include professional formation leaves at least 1 week each year and 1 month during 1 year of every quadrennium. So every 4 years, a clergy person is supposed to have a month off for doing continuing education and spiritual development. Such leave shall not be considered part of the minister's vacation and shall be planned in consultation with their church or other agency to which they serve. They are appointed. So that gives you a background. Now, as a district superintendent, I would often, back in the day when I was a district superintendent, I would often read those paragraphs to Staff Parish Relations Committee, and they would generally say, well, gee, that's nice, and go on about their business. So we have not been good as clergy for either taking appropriate time for renewal, nor have churches been insistent to see to it that their pastors are doing that important work. Now, what I want to do is to tell you a little bit of a story. Some of you have heard this already, so indulge me if you have, but I feel like I need to give you perspective in order for you to understand what led us to this renewal leave. In January of 2007, I decided, along with the encouragement of the SPRC committee, the Staff Parish Relations Committee, which is the personnel team of the local church. I was serving in Mason, and I applied for a Lilly grant. Eli Lilly does incredible work in grant, in giving grants for clergy and people of faith. They support incredible work all across the country. And I applied to this Lilly Endowment grant, but I did not get the grant in my first proposal. I used that as a learning experience, and I called the person in Indiana who oversees the program, and I said, tell me where I can improve. She spent probably 45 minutes with me on the phone of helping me walk through my proposal to better it up for the next year, of which we submitted it. And this time we were given the Lilly Foundation grant. So in 2008, I was given what at the time was $45,000 to be one of 60 clergy around the country who was given a Lilly Foundation grant. We got that word in October, and we began making plans. And the plans were wonderful, wonderful plans. I mean, we were going to go to Europe for several weeks. I was going to do some study at what's called the Royal School of Church Music in England. We were going to do some work with historic sites of the Wesleys, do a Wesley tour. We were going to go to Taizé in France. We were going to go to Iona, which is a community in Scotland. We were going to do all of this, and Pigeon received word in that same October that her job with State Farm that she had had for 23 years was being eliminated. Well, that didn't really matter too much because she would be off for the summer and we could do what we needed to do. And then January 1 of 2009, I received a phone call from Bishop Keaton. And he said, I want to meet you tomorrow morning for breakfast. I said, well, I'm not used to saying no to my bishop, but no, I can't, because I'm in Missouri, taking care of my folks. He said, when do you get back? I said, in 3 days. He said, then in 3 days, I want to meet you for breakfast. And he said, and by the way, I want you to bring your wife. Well, I knew what was up. So we met at a restaurant in North Lansing, and he began talking to my wife as though I wasn't there. He told her all these things that he had grown to appreciate and the things that he admired in me and my ministry, and that's the reason why he was going to appoint me as a district superintendent. Then he finally looked at me and he said, is there anything that could screw this up? And I said, yes. I said, I was just given a Hundley Foundation grant, and we had planned and have made the plans and starting to make arrangements to be gone for the entire summer. And I said, I don't really want to give that up. He said, oh, don't worry. Don't worry. He said, we'll work it out. And you can do your renewal leave and then come to be on the cabinet. So I called, the next day, I called the Lilly Endowment office and I said, we have a new wrinkle. I said, the bishop has just appointed me to be a district superintendent, and what does that do to our plan and the grant? She said, well, you either say no to the appointment or you send the money back. I said, really? She said, yes. I said, well, the bishop says that he could work with us and make this work. And she said, no, no, no. She said, the only people in the whole world that don't get our rules and regulations are United Methodist bishops. She said, that's the deal. You either refuse the appointment or you send the money back. So we thought about it for a couple of days, and we decided we'd send the money back. Because we felt at that time that that's what we needed to do. So for 4 years, I was the Lansing District Superintendent. And when, in the 4th year, there was a change, and Bishop Keaton left and Bishop Kesey came. And at that time, I was named the Dean of the Cabinet, which means I was the chairperson of the district superintendents, responsible for a whole bunch of work, extra work. And the standard in our conference was that when you served as the Dean of the Cabinet, that upon your conclusion of being the Dean of the Cabinet, you get a 3-month renewal leave. So I was looking forward to this 3-month renewal leave. Well, the fall, that fall was when Pigeon was downsized in 2012. And I said to Bishop Kesey in my one-on-one, I said, at the time I was 61 years old, 60 or 61, and I said, I said, I've been at this long enough to know that if I stay 6 years as a district superintendent, and then you assign me to a church, they will know that all this is an intro. We're biding time to get you to retirement. And I said, I don't think that's fair to either the church or to me. So if something comes available that I fit, I'd be willing to leave the cabinet to take an appointment in the church. The first week of January, we were at cabinet retreat, and it had become very clear that Gary and Lori Haller needed to go to Birmingham first. And we pondered our way through that and made the call, and they accepted, which opened this church. And when this church opened, Bishop Kesey, who always sat right next to me, she turned to me and she said, can we talk about you for this appointment? And after I picked myself up off the floor, I said, sure, if that's what you think is best. She said, okay, what I want you to do is to go spend a little time walking around the grounds, call your wife, tell her what's happening, and we'll see you in an hour and a half. So I called Pigeon, and she said, there's no reason for me to stay in Lansing. My job has been eliminated. And I said, okay. So when I came back in 90 minutes later, my name was on the board at First United Methodist Church in Grand Rapids. What that meant was that I lost my 3-month leave. And I'm not sorry about that. It has been wonderful. It was wonderful to be appointed here. But what also then began happening was that I got into relationship, and it's a very important friendship to me, with Chandler Stokes, who is the pastor, was the pastor, he's now retired, but he was the pastor at Westminster Presbyterian. And Chandler had received a Lilly Foundation grant 2 years ago. And so we were talking through his application process because he knew that I had done it. And so he received that. And he said, I think you need to try it again. And I said, I don't want to go through all that work again. He said, no, I'm serious. So I came and I talked with SBRC, and I think Dave was on the SBRC, Cheryl was on the SBRC at that time. And we decided that we would go for it. And I wrote and they wrote, and we had lots of dialogue. And lo and behold, we got the grant again. Only this time it was $5,000 better. So the grant was for $50,000 $35,000 that was earmarked for our travel and my continuing education expenses, and then $15,000 to cover the expenses in my absence, to take care of the pulpit supply that we had for 17 weeks, I think, and plus some staff activation. We paid for the tent on the third Sunday of August for the picnic, because it was sort of a regather event. So we have spent all of that money, and we're all grateful for it. The plan changed in the last year because of the health of my parents. I had planned to do some of the things that I had wanted to do in the first go-around, and that was to go to Europe. This was our 25th anniversary year, so we were going to do one of the river cruises in Europe, and then do some work in London and Oxford, Cambridge. We were going to go to Taizé, and it was going to be a glorious thing. But the health of my parents changed that, and I could not justify being across the ocean should something happen, and I would need to be back to Springfield quickly. And fortunately for us, that ended up being true. There was a pretty significant crisis this summer that I had to drop everything and get to Springfield. And it was very difficult. It was stressful beyond belief. But I just tried to imagine what that would have been like had I been in Europe. So what we did was that we reframed everything and stayed in the country. We went to a spiritual formation retreat called the Academy of Spiritual Formation. And if you ever want to explore a week that will really change your life, I would encourage you to look on the website of the Upper Room, which is where it's housed. The Academy of Spiritual Formation is under the umbrella of the Upper Room. And they do these Academy of Spiritual Formations all over the country. They bring in some of the best people as their weekly facilitators and teachers. And it was our second time going. And each time it has been just outstanding. It has just been wonderful. And this was no different. We went to St. Simon's Island, which is in South Georgia. We drove so that we could go to some of our favorite places. We stopped in Asheville, North Carolina, and we stopped for several days in Savannah, Georgia, which I dearly love. I could move there tomorrow. Of course, I couldn't afford it, but I could move there. And then spent the week at St. Simon's Island. On the way back, one of the things that Pigeons always wanted to do is to see where the Masters golf tournament is played. So we went to Augusta, and we saw the gates where the Masters tournament is played. But we at least saw it, and I zoomed in from out on the street and saw Butler Canyon. Got a picture. But that's as close as you can get. And then we spent several days in North Georgia at a place called Cherry Log, Georgia. It is a place maybe 50 miles south of the Tennessee border. So you're about an hour from Chattanooga, and you're also about an hour and a half from Asheville. It is absolutely beautiful, and if some of you will remember, I think it was a year ago, almost two, Roberta Bondi came and spoke for All Saints Day, and then did a couple of workshops with us. Roberta became a dear friend through the Academy of Spiritual Formation, and she lives in Cherry Lawn. And so we went and stayed with her and enjoyed just a wonderful long weekend. I think we were there 3 full days. And all the homes in Cherry Log are made, they're log cabins. And it is just absolutely gorgeous. It's a beautiful setting. It's just wonderful. And Roberta kept reminding me, she said, yes, it's as beautiful as it's still Georgia. And I said, what does that mean? And she said, everything you can imagine about the image of it's just Georgia. I said, okay. Then we also, the next trip was about 2.5 weeks, and we went first to Niagara on the Lake. Anybody here been to Niagara on the Lake? Isn't it beautiful? Who else? Yeah, that's right. You have rowing on the Niagara River. It's like going to a foreign country. What did you say? It is, yeah. It's not really foreign. But the hospitality, it's a community that is built around what's called the Shaw Festival. And so they have made a name for themselves, much like Stratford. And so the Shaw Festival is built around the writings and some of the plays of George Bernard Shaw. And there are many, I think 3 theaters, and there is one theater that is absolutely one of the most beautiful theaters I've ever been in. We stayed in a bed and breakfast right downtown so that we could walk everywhere. I didn't even start the car for 4 days. And we walked everywhere. There were wonderful restaurants. We walked to the theater and saw plays. It was just a wonderful, wonderful time. I commend it to you. If you've never been, you should go. It is absolutely beautiful. And then from there we drove to Boston, where we stayed several days in a hotel right on the harbor, and the Sons of Serendip took us around Boston. We had just a wonderful day with Micah and Kendall, the singer, and the cellist was who we spent the day with. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful day. We actually rode one of those things that the duck boat. Yeah. Before Branson, which was just an awful tragedy. But we were on one of the duck boat excursions around Boston, and that was wonderful too. And then we got on the ship, and if you were here a couple of weeks ago for my sermon, when I told about our experience, I won't go into that again. But it was 11 days, 11-day cruise, on a ship that was not one of the big ocean-going vessels. It was 185 passengers. And while that was nice, we were, I think, the youngest people on the boat, which helped me decide that it's not really time for me to either retire and certainly not to move into a retirement community yet. I need to wait a while. But we went to wonderful places along that eastern seaboard. Martha's Vineyard, Newport, Rhode Island, Provincetown, Massachusetts. We went up through Bar Harbor, Rockland, Maine, Portland, Maine, and it was just wonderful. It was just a beautiful, beautiful experience. Besides the 24 hours that I was sick, and that was really kind of our anniversary trip. And besides two that I went to Missouri, I did two Missouri trips, and then we did two trips to a timeshare that we have up in Bel Air at Shanty Creek. And we were up there twice. But besides that, we went to Palo Alto, California for a week, where we had a chance to visit our daughter. Our oldest daughter did a year of clinical pastoral education. Emily feels called to some kind of chaplaincy work. Emily's story is a very interesting story. She went to Ball State and got her architecture degree and moved to Seattle and was working in green build architecture in Seattle. Did it for almost 20 years and felt a call to ministry and left architecture and went to seminary. And then got this wonderful opportunity to be in a residency program for CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education, at Stanford University, at the Stanford University Medical Center. And what we discovered the week that we were there, we also learned that she had been given a fellowship beyond her CPE year to develop a pastoral care program with both patients, families, and staff in the bone marrow transplant unit. So she's very excited, and we're excited for her, and that's happening now. She's involved in that. And Jessica, our middle daughter, was able to go with us, so it was the four of us out there for the week. And then I did, the rest of the time, I did writing and reading and interviewing. So going back to the sabbatical, the title that they live with in the Lilly Foundation is What Makes Your Heart Sing? Well, for a musician, that's right up my alley. And so I just took off with that phrase, what makes your heart sing? And what I learned in my doctoral work that I should have known, intrinsically I should have known, but I didn't. Had never put the pieces together. But what I discovered is that I learned my leadership style more from music school than I did from seminary. And what that means is that I have long treated my congregations as though they were a musical ensemble, not just a congregation. And what I wanted to do was flesh that out some more and to work on it. And I'm in the enviable place right now where all of my conducting teachers are still living. And so I began making contact with each of them and spending time with them and listening to them and sharing memories of things that they taught me and asking them questions about why they did particular things particular ways. It has been just a remarkably wonderful, a twofold trip down memory lane, because what I was able to do was to reconnect with people who have had incredible influence on me. To be able to say, eyeball to eyeball, thank you for your influence. This is what I've done with it. A year ago, my high school band director, his name is Ray Roth. Ray Roth was just kind of an institution of his own in Flint. And we had great bands and orchestras in our high school. When I graduated from high school, Ray left and got his doctorate and became the chair of the music department at University of Michigan Flint and put the whole music program together there. And it's intriguing that all of the band directors that I've had that have had a significant influence on me have gone on to do something in administration. Ken Bloomquist was the band director at Michigan State University for many years and then went back to be the band director after he served 10 years as the department chair of music at Michigan State and changed it from a department of music to a school of music. And so I've had these models throughout my life of musicians who were incredibly gifted leaders. And I wanted to pursue that. And so I have now about 3 chapters completed, I think, of a book that I am writing on leadership lessons learned from a conductor's podium. I spent time this summer interviewing and connecting with, I already told you, Ray Roth, Ken Bloomquist, Dr. Charles Smith, who was my primary conducting teacher at Michigan State, David Lockington. I spent a number of hours with David Lockington, who is the conductor emeritus of the Grand Rapids Symphony, and an incredibly thoughtful and skillful person. I spent several days with Jerry Blackstone, who is just newly retired as the director of choral activities and the conducting program at the University of Michigan. And yes, I even went to U of M.
Best day of your life.
Yeah. And I wore green and white. But it was a terrific opportunity. And what Jerry did, without me even realizing it, what Jerry did was that we spent most of the day, and then he went into rehearsals, and I was watching him do rehearsals, and then followed it with a conducting symposium. So all of the conducting students were gathered together in sort of a learning environment. And so without any warning, he just said to me, "We're yours. Talk to us about leadership." And so we had wonderful conversation that day, and it was really fascinating that in his conducting symposium, 5 of the 15 or 16 students that were in there were preachers' kids. People who knew what I was talking about because they had seen it in their fathers. And it was wonderful. It was a terrific thing. I spent a day with David Ryle, who is the new, he's been there 15 years, I think now. He's the conductor of the choral program at Michigan State. Jack Stamp, who came to Michigan, or came to University Church when I was there. And Jack is newly retired, but was the chairman of the Department of Music at Indiana University, which is one of the major universities in music in the country. And then I started conversation with James Curnow, who is also very important to me. He is now a composer who does an incredible amount of writing. And if you've probably been in bands, you've played something by Jim Curnow. Jim was in Flint. His first job out of Michigan State was to be the director of the band program at Mott Community College in Flint. And Jim is also a person of faith and was the director of the Flint Salvation Army Band, of which he kind of twisted my arm to be a part of the Salvation Army Band for a year. So I played solo cornet in the Salvation Army Band for a year. But Jim was very, very important to me at a very important time in my life. There are 3 other people that I will be in touch with. One is a man named James Jordan, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Anton Armstrong. Some of you know the name anyway of Anton because he has been the choral director at St. Olaf College in Minnesota, but he was also, I think he was the founding conductor of the Calvin Alumni Choir, and worked on his doctorate while he was the director of the Calvin Alumni Choir. And then John Shows, who was my band director when I was at Evangel College. But James Jordan is a prolific writer. And I have never, and even if you're not a musician, this book is probably the best book I have ever read. It's called The Musician's Soul. And he talks about the spirituality of making music. And it is absolutely mesmerizing what he does in his study and in his writing. And we have communicated via email. We have not set up a time for us to talk, but he's very interested in the whole concept of pastoral leader in light of all of his research and writing. So that has been very intriguing. I read, and I'll give you the books that I read during these last 4 months. I read 3 biographies of Leonard Bernstein, a biography of Robert Shaw. I read another book of Robert Shaw's writings. That one of the things that Robert Shaw did with his musical ensemble, didn't matter whether it was the Atlanta Symphony, which is what he ultimately retired from, but every ensemble he ever conducted, he would write letters to the choir or the orchestra weekly to motivate, to encourage, to explain to them what he was doing and why he was doing it. And it is just a fascinating read if you're into that sort of thing. But there are letters of Robert Shaw. I read 2 general conducting books and then 2 books by James Jordan, The Musician's Soul, and then he has a second book called The Musician's Spirit. I both read and listened twice in the car as I drove to something called The Wisdom of Sundays. I don't know if any of you are Oprah freaks. Anybody? Have you ever listened to The Wisdom of Sundays? It's a program on the Oprah channel where she interviews many times, most of the time, spiritual people who are delving into learning more about the spirit. She has a book out, and then these lectures, these collection of lectures on CD called The Wisdom of Sundays. And it is just a wonderful, wonderful tool. I read 3 books on writing. Unless It Moves the Human Heart is the title of it, by Roger Rosenblatt. This is Water by David Foster Wallace, and The Writing Life by Annie Dillard. I read Gratitude by Oliver Sacks, An Altar in the World by Barbara Brown Taylor, and Longing for Home by Fred Buechner. And 3 books on the Beatitudes. You're about to hear something about in my sermon. I also took a leadership test. It was a lengthy test with a consultation regarding the results of that test to identify my strengths and weaknesses in leadership. So that was kind of the 4 months. That's what I did, and that's kind of how I did it. And what I want to do before I open it up to a few minutes of questions is that I want to tell you a story. And the story is something that I have pondered a lot this summer. Some of you know, some of you don't know. So let me just kind of give you a synopsis. One of the things that I can't say pastoral ministry was my second choice, because that wouldn't be true. It was God's choice. My choice would have been if I would have been a conductor. If God wasn't in the picture, that's what I was going to do with my life. And I have a master's degree in conducting, and loved it. I loved making music, loved performing. But God had a different idea, and the way this lived itself out is that every door, and I genuinely mean this, every door that I ever knocked on to get either a professorship or conducting conducting job in a college or a university, every door that seemingly was going to open, the last minute would close. And at the same time a door would close, a different door would open in the church. And it was always that way. There was one professorship at Mississippi State University. They were going to start a church music program, and I had interviewed, they had offered me the position, and all of a sudden the funding dried up, and before I could even make arrangements to move there, they called and said, "We're really sorry, but we can't do it." But whenever I left University Church in 1990, I had been the associate pastor and minister of music for 8 years there. And when I left, I went to be the chaplain at Ingham Medical Center, and really was what I thought was going to be out of music. And I got a call asking me to audition for being the conductor of the Steiner Chorale, which is sort of a semi-professional chorale in the Lansing area. And there were 5 of us who were the finalists. And they whittled it down to the last 3. And the last 3 had to come and work with the choir. And they selected me. And when they introduced me to the choir, this is what they gave me. And they introduced themselves, they introduced the choir, they told me about their history, and then they handed me the baton. And they said, the president of the ensemble said, "Take us where we need to go and treat us well. We're your ensemble." We don't have anything that communicates that kind of gracious affirmation to a pastor. We don't. Battery must have gone. We don't.
Use your band teacher voice.
Yeah, I'll just talk about it. What we do, particularly in the United Methodist Church, is that we think appointment does that. And it doesn't. It just doesn't do it. Because just because the bishop and the cabinet believes that there is a match between a pastor and a congregation really doesn't mean anything until the rubber hits the road. And there is no way for a congregation to gather itself in the form of a baton and say to a pastor, "We're yours. Take us where we need to go." And that image alone has been worth my mental journey. Because there has to be a way. See, in a congregation, and this happened, Sandy did this. She ordered these chairs the way they are. But you're sitting in sort of the arrangement of an orchestra.
Bill.
You're sitting in sort of an arrangement of an orchestra. You have the first violins here, you have the second violins here, you have the violas, you have the cellos, you have the basses, you have the woodwind section in the middle, you have the brass, and then you have the percussion.
We're in the back.
Yeah. You're the stable. Yeah. In more ways than one. You're the stable.
I was on the MSU drum line just so that nice blue and yellow gentleman over there knows. This is me behaving, people.
But whenever I begin the work of being pastor, what I do is very much like what I would do if I were in an ensemble. First thing you got to do is that you've got to connect with people. All of your skill, all of your stick ability, all of whatever it is you think you are good at in music goes right out the window if you are not a people person. And there are lots of conductors who are not people persons. Just as there are lots of pastors who are not people persons. And so that's what I am working on, and I continue to work on. And that's just a little snippet of some of the work that I've done. And I would be remiss if I didn't say to Staff Parish, a huge, and there are many here, Peggy as chairperson, Gretchen, Richard, who else? Yeah, sorry. I was looking around. I was looking around. I didn't see the cellist, the solo cellist. But I would be remiss if I didn't thank them for the opportunity to do what we did. It was good for Pigeon and I. I did not realize, I really didn't realize just how exhausted I had become. And while I love what I do, and I wouldn't do anything else, there is an exhaustion to this job that wears. And so whenever I start with that instruction from the Book of Discipline, it's not a light thing. The discipline realizes that pastors need restoration. They need times of reflection. And matter of fact, I would say that that's probably one of the downsides of our culture, is that we don't rest enough, we don't reflect enough, we don't put ourselves into opportunity where we just stop and just take inventory of what we do and why we do it and what's the next challenge. So what I did discover is that I am nowhere near ready to retire. I just don't even want to think about it for several years, and then if I think about it, I still might keep going. But the discipline says that we're supposed to retire at 72. I believe that's ageism. I'm serious. There are lots of pastors who are over 72 years old that are very effective. There are 55-year-olds who are already out to lunch. It has nothing to do with age. It has everything to do with vitality and whether or not you are a lifelong learner and you keep reinventing yourself. So I am grateful for the time. So I know it's time, but I'll give you a couple of minutes. Anybody have question or reaction?